Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's National Caribbean American Heritage Month program. My name is Brent Fields, and I'm an Associate Director in the Division of Investment Management, and I'm also a co-sponsor of the Caribbean American Heritage Committee, along with my colleague, Cicely Lamothe. Like you, I'm looking forward to hearing from our guest speaker, Marla Ducaron, today. And before we begin, I would like to introduce Chair Gary Gensler, Cicely, and of course, Marla, who are also gracious to join us today. As I know all of you know, Chair Gensler has served as our chair since April 17th of 2021, and he was formerly the chair of the CFTC, leading the Obama administration's reform of the $400 trillion swaps market. He also was senior advisor to U.S. Senator Paul Sarbanes in writing the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and was Undersecretary of the Treasury for Domestic Finance and Assistant Secretary of the Treasury from 1997 to 2001. In recognition for his service, he was awarded the Alexander Hamilton Award, the U.S. Treasury's highest honor. Next, today's moderator is my colleague and co-sponsor of the Caribbean American Heritage Committee, Cicely Lamothe, who is an Associate Director for Disclosure Operations in the Division of Corporation Finance and oversees the division's Disclosure Review Program for public companies and the Office of Assessment and Continuous Improvement. Cicely joined the division in 2002. And then finally, our very distinguished speaker is Marla Ducaron. Marla has more than 20 years of experience as an economist in the Caribbean financial services sector and is regarded internationally as a chief advisor on regional economic issues. She's a native of Trinidad and currently resides in Barbados. She earned her bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in economics from the University of the West Indies. Chair Gensler, Cicely, and Marla, I welcome all of you and thank you for joining us for today's event. And now I will turn it over to Chair Gensler.
Thank you, Brent, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the commemorative program for the Securities and Exchange Commission's 2022 Caribbean American Heritage Month. My thanks to everybody working on the committee and the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion for putting today's event together. I also want to thank, most importantly, Marla, Ducaron, for taking the time to join us today from Barbados. I wish I was there with you, by the way, so it's terrific. But a native of Trinidad, Marla offers decades of experience as an economist, advisor in the Caribbean, and she's going to speak to us. I understand, Marla, you're going to speak to us today about gender equality, opportunities to level the playing field for small economies like those in the Caribbean, but not only in the Caribbean, and how climate change affects Caribbean nations. So a lot of really good things to hear from Marla on. So I'm going to be brief. The U.S., we're celebrating Caribbean American Heritage Month. We've done this for now, I think, since 2006, our 17th time trying to do this, both in recognition of the close ties between our country and the Caribbean, but in acknowledgement of all the contributions that Caribbean Americans have made to our country. So it's both ways. And as anyone who's listened to the soundtrack from the hit musical Hamilton knows, these contributions go way back to our country's founding and of course continue to this day. I mean, of course, from Hamilton, who was born on the island of Nevis, to the late Colin Powell, to Shirley Chisholm, to Sidney Poitier, and our current Vice President, Kamala Harris, and on and on and on. I hope that the SEC can be, and we work every day to try to make it a place where we can bring our whole selves to work. And I believe diversity truly enhances our country, our agency, our work. And that means celebrating our various histories, cultures, and stories, and working to make our agency as inclusive as possible. We've got more work to do, though. These events are just one way we can do that. And I hope you'll share your thoughts on how we can make the SEC a more diverse, inclusive, equitable place. I thank you. I hope all of you enjoyed Marla's presentation. I encourage you to participate in the Q&A. Marla, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for that warm welcome and for having me, Chair Gensler. You're welcome to come to Barbados anytime, although I think today is not a good day. We have a storm which has not been named yet, but it's hitting us as we speak. So maybe in a week or two. I'm super impressed that you have 3 female commissioners, and my greetings and gratitude to them also. And my deepest appreciation to the Caribbean American Heritage Committee of the SEC for inviting me to address today's forum and for your impeccable organization of today's event. This is a huge honor for me to have been invited to address this most prestigious organization and its dedicated and fabulous people. The fact that the SEC has a Caribbean American Heritage Committee says 2 things to me. One, that the SEC fully understands the importance of diversity in building successful and resilient operations. And 2, that the SEC understands that being a minority community puts us at a disadvantage, and to overcome this setback and to empower any minority to play its part in nation building, deliberate policy efforts must be made. So I congratulate the SEC for its inclusiveness, progressiveness, and for its efforts to establish and maintain fairness. And on the issue of fairness, coming from the Caribbean, we fully understand what it means to be unfair, as we say in Barbados. We know the unfairness that our ancestors endured, the unfairness of perverse reparations and embargoes, of invasion and exodus, of discrimination and subjugation. And I'm not giving a history lesson here. Such injustices are very much a part of Caribbean life today. I want to share with you 3 main sources of unfairness that I live with every day, including today, as a West Indian woman, as a single mother, and as a Caribbean economist. And I challenge you to imagine with me what the Caribbean could look like if we eliminate these 3 important vectors of unfairness: gender inequality, climate catastrophes, and institutionalized racism and discrimination against post-colonial states. In Trinidad, where I'm from, we have an expression of exasperation, or fed up see, as we say, with nonsense. A chance, please. Imagine with me a different future, one where all of us in the Caribbean are given a fair chance. So first, imagine that gender equality was a reality in our region. Already, women unfairly carry the weight of this pandemic because we account for the majority of frontline workers, the majority of displaced workers, and the majority of informal workers. We earn less pay for the same work, sometimes as much as 50% less. And even though we are more skilled and educated than men in the Caribbean, and despite being more educated, we consistently represent the majority of the unemployed and underemployed in society. However, women are still less likely to have access to social protection such as health insurance, pensions, and unemployment benefits. During her 40-year career, a Caribbean woman will earn $332,000 less than a man on average. We therefore work on average 4 years longer in our lifetime, and we get less sleep and less exercise, with untold effects on our physical and mental well-being. On top of all of this, we suffer the majority of the consequences of society's ills, such as crime, violence, abuse, and poverty. Single women head the majority of our households in this region, but are more likely to be poor. As a matter of fact, women make up 70% of the world's poor. Women consistently perform at least twice as much, up to 10 times more, unpaid care work in the home, often on top of their paid work. I believe that women are the world's most underutilized renewable resource. And if we are given the opportunity to participate fully in the economy and to truly unleash our superpowers, I believe women can lift the world out of its current morass. But why are women consistently being shut out and left behind? Why are women and our rights still being marginalized, as reflected by the recent Supreme Court ruling? This is a complex question, and the answers vary somewhat across cultures. But consider the fact that it is very difficult and in some cases impossible for a woman to gain employment outside of the home when she shoulders a disproportionate share of caregiving responsibilities at home, caring for children and increasingly the elderly. This unfair treatment works to the detriment of everyone, including the men and the ones we are caring for. But when women are empowered to engage in paid work, it fuels the economy and drives the whole society forward. Not just the woman, the whole society. In fact, it is estimated that gender inequality costs the economy some 15% of GDP. When women work, we invest 90% of our income back into our families, but men only 30 to 40%. Maternal income was found to increase family nutrition by 4 to 7 times more than the income of fathers. Gender inequality costs women in developing countries $9 trillion each year. And at 90% reinvestment back into our families, this means that children and men in developing countries are missing out on $8.1 trillion annually in support. Jeffrey Sachs estimated that it would cost $175 billion per year for 20 years to end poverty. But by this metric I mentioned earlier, if we close the gender gap in the developing world, we could end poverty in less than 5 years. Let's look at this another way. As I mentioned earlier, women perform 2 to 10 times more unpaid care work in the home. The value of this work is estimated at least $10.8 trillion each year. Again, at 90% reinvestment in families, we're looking at $9.72 trillion in income that families are missing out on globally. Furthermore, paying women equally could increase human capital wealth by more than $160 trillion, which is almost twice global GDP. And achieving gender equality will add to the global economy the size of the Chinese and US economies combined. Why would anyone want to deny themselves this level and pace of progress? Would you? If not, then find ways within your remit to support women and families with quality and affordable childcare and care for the elderly. Find ways to be more flexible with work arrangements for parents and caregivers in particular. Find ways to promote transparency in regulations for equal pay for equal work across the board. Find ways within your remit to give women a chance, please. Now let's discuss the second source of unfairness. Imagine that the advanced economies gave developing countries a chance to compete on a level playing field. I would like to read a list of countries for you. Bear with me, please, it's a bit long. Afghanistan, American Samoa, Barbados, Burkina Faso, Cambodia, Cayman Islands, North Korea, Fiji, Guam, Haiti, Iran, Jamaica, Jordan, Mali, Morocco, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Palau, Panama, the Philippines, Samoa, Senegal, South Sudan, Syria, Trinidad and Tobago, Uganda, US Virgin Islands, Vanuatu, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. What strikes you about these countries? Well, they are relatively small or geopolitically and economically insignificant, developing, former European colonies in almost all cases. But what else? Well, not one of these countries is predominantly white. And guess what? All of these countries are blacklisted by the European Union. How is that for spot-on nomenclature? EU blacklisted countries combined account for less than 2% of global tax losses, global money laundering, and global terrorism financing. And the EU and their allies, 98%. EU members of parliament have highlighted the fact that jurisdictions currently on the EU tax haven blacklist account for less than 2% of worldwide tax revenue losses, and that EU member states are responsible for 36% of tax havens globally. EU members of parliament further called the EU's list of tax havens confusing and inefficient, and stated that EU member states forgot something when composing this list: actual tax havens. Furthermore, EU blacklisted countries account for less than 1% of humans alive today and produce under 1.1% of global GDP. The chances that we are the real problem, therefore, are slim. Assuming the EU genuinely but naively believed that blacklisting could reduce global tax evasion, money laundering, and terrorism financing, the result of their blacklisting must come as an embarrassing surprise to them, as they have actually increased the risk of tax evasion, money laundering, and terrorism financing. How? Because blacklisting directly contributes to de-risking and therefore higher cash usage. Indeed, in most countries worldwide, cash in circulation increased between 4 to 7% annually from 2014 to 2019. In blacklisted countries, more and more transactions are forced into cash, including cross-border transactions. And what better way to evade taxes, launder money, and finance terrorism than with cash? Talk about unintended consequences and perverse outcomes, if we assume their intentions were genuine and noble in the first place. But if you wanted to launder money, would you open your account in the Cayman Islands? Probably not, because cockroaches avoid bright lights. Blacklisting ensures that the bad guys know just which countries to avoid and where they are less likely to be caught. Blacklisting, therefore, does not result in less money being laundered, less terrorism, or less taxes being evaded. We know that this was not the real reason behind blacklisting. This is about competition at best and institutionalized discrimination most obviously. EU laws exclude EU member states from appearing on their own blacklists despite overwhelming evidence of non-adherence to their own standards and laws. Unilaterally blacklisting us when they break their own laws is deliberate, targeted, state-sanctioned, and institutionalized discrimination. Furthermore, the EU's action against us is brutally disproportionate relative to our insignificant level of economic activity versus that of EU member states and their conveniently omitted allies. This is in direct contravention of the EU's own doctrine of proportionality. There is no known effective legal or other recourse for us to pursue to appeal for justice. And the penalties being imposed on us are crippling our already struggling economies. This is nothing short of economic warfare. How is it not when Vanuatu, for example, which is the world's 30th poorest nation, even poorer than Haiti, also the world's most vulnerable country to natural disasters, having been hit by cyclones in 2015 and 2020, is blacklisted twice by the EU? How is it not economic warfare when blacklisted countries represent 2% of the problem and them 98%? When will Europeans ever take their feet off the necks of their former colonies? But we have seen this movie before. Since the beginning of time, the powerful have created structures to maintain and solidify their position, which is fine, but everything has its limits. Institutionalized discrimination and systemic marginalization of weaker states only radicalizes and drives their leaders towards other pariahs and their most vulnerable to seek refuge in the powerful nations. But there is no new world left for us to flee to as the Pilgrims did, just the so-called first world. And eventually our problems become yours. As Bob Marley famously said, when the rain falls, it don't fall on one man's housetop. Remember that. On the third source of unfairness, imagine with me that the world's biggest polluters fund the $2.5 trillion needed to save the homes and lives of those of us on the front lines of the climate crisis. In Barbados, I'm living through this climate crisis, which dumps my height and seaweed on our shores on a weekly basis. In the middle of the pandemic on April 9th last year, we endured the frightening eruption of La Soufriere volcano in St. Vincent, which dumped several inches of ash from the bowels of the earth on top of us for weeks. 6 weeks later, we had a freak storm with 46,000 lightning strikes in 90 minutes, creating massive flooding. 2 weeks later, we had our first hurricane in 66 years. We are lucky that it moved over us in less than 2 hours, whereas Hurricane Dorian sat on Grand Bahama and Abaco for 2 days in 2019 and caused 465,000 new displacements in 7 Caribbean countries. Every year without fail, West Indians suffer losses of countless lives and livelihoods and physical damage 2 to 3 times the size of our economy, while we account for less than 1% of global carbon emissions. The frequency and intensity of storms is increasing, and reconstruction after disasters is already the single most significant contributor to the increase in public debt in many countries on the front lines of the climate crisis. Keeping temperature increases below the 2 degrees Celsius versus pre-industrial levels means bringing global net greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050. Estimates of the investment needed for this green energy transition range from $2.5 to $4 trillion a year. If G7 central banks, instead of buying $25 trillion in government bonds since 2009, had instead purchased $25 trillion in bonds that financed a green transition, they would have achieved their desired economic impact and reached halfway to halting the climate crisis. Perhaps only coincidentally, the quantitative easers, the US, UK, Eurozone, and Japan, are also the largest contributors to the global stock of greenhouse gases. In other words, the world's biggest polluters have already demonstrated the funding capacity needed for the net zero transition, but they have chosen not to deploy it for that purpose. And that, my friends, leaves a $2.5 trillion question. If they don't fund it, who will? The industrialization that was largely financed by colonization and which made the advanced economies into what they are today led to the carbon levels that have caused the climate crisis. And these industrialized nations are reneging on their responsibility to clean up after themselves. Furthermore, if we don't immediately reduce greenhouse gas emissions and implement the green transition, we will see the volume of climate refugees continue to grow as people are forced to leave their homes that are no longer livable. The Caribbean already suffers from persistent net outward migration, and the UN estimates that up to 2020, over 7 million persons had already left the Caribbean. The climate crisis has only hastened the pace of exits, as countless West Indians have lost their lives and loved ones, their homes and livelihoods due to storms, floods, droughts, and coastal erosion. And we are perpetually traumatized by the rising frequency and severity of climate catastrophes. Net outward migration places a major drag on development and amplifies an already vicious cycle. Bottom line, the world's biggest polluters have the proven financial capacity and more so the moral obligation to finance the mitigation of the climate crisis that they caused, with their feet on our necks then as they remain now, and we can't breathe. Absent a net zero world by 2050, the climate crisis and the associated climate refugee flow will only worsen, and nobody will be spared the fallout. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Marla. That was certainly very eye-opening. I do invite people to include their questions in the chat feature. I think we're going to move to our fireside chat portion, and I have a couple of questions myself that I'd like to follow up on. But anyone from the audience also has the opportunity to provide some questions in the chat, and we will focus on those in short order. So Marla, you started the discussion talking about gender equality. Gender equality is a key focus for many countries globally. How much does the Caribbean stand to gain by promoting gender equality?
Well, Cicely, that's a complex question, but estimates are that we stand to gain at least 15% of GDP if women are given a fair chance to gain employment outside the home, paid employment, and also if we are paid equally as men for equal work. And 15% of GDP is not a small sum. I mean, many of us struggle to grow even 1 or 2% every year. So 15% is certainly something that will be a windfall for many of us. It will be a game changer.
So one of the other things I think that you also brought up was blacklisting. And in many countries, including the US, blacklisting is an unfortunate reality. So can you elaborate a little bit more on some of the impacts that you've seen or identified of blacklisting to smaller economies?
So one of the interesting things about blacklisting by the EU, that is that in the first place, the EU has no authority to do this. Imagine, Cicely, if I came up to you and said, Cicely, your diet is unhealthy. You need to switch to a plant-based diet. Otherwise, you're going to die. So you're never going to be allowed to go to the supermarket and buy anything that's animal derived. You're going to say to me, excuse me, who are you to say this to me? You're just an economist. What do you know, right? And that's exactly what the EU has done. Because we have the FATF, as you know, that is the global authority on all, AML, CFT, regulations and standards and enforcement and reviews and assessments. And then you have the OECD that handles global tax matters. And all countries either agree or not to be subject to these standards and to be scrutinized by the OECD and the FATF, so they are the authorities. The EU pitched up and unilaterally decided, hang on, I'm going to just decide what standards and rules I think should apply to you. And if I feel like you have not adhered or complied with these rules, I'm going to blacklist you. So in the first place, they have no authority to do this. Secondly, they don't even adhere to their own standards. And so what it does to us, when you think about, first of all, the reputational implications of being blacklisted, immediately a country like the Cayman Islands or a country like Barbados, when someone wants to open a business, for example, and let's say they're a foreign company and they want to open a branch here, the first thing that's going to pop up on their Google search is that this country has been blacklisted, and they don't understand the context, so immediately there's a reputational implication. So it affects us from a tourism standpoint, from a doing business, ease of doing business standpoint, or I should say this ease of doing business standpoint, from an investment standpoint, and just in terms of sheer economic performance. And then when you get down into more detail, when you have to send a wire transfer out of a blacklisted country or into a blacklisted country, the amount of scrutiny that the banks subject you to, it means they don't even put your wire transfer through automatically. They stop it and they call you up and tell you, I want all of this information, including your mother's birth certificate. And if you don't provide all of this information, I'm sorry, we're not going to send your wire transfer through. So could you imagine what it does for trade, what it does to the economy when cross-border transactions cost more, take longer, and sometimes are never even effected? So it has huge implications on us, and the EU is brutal and negligent in the way that it applies these rules unilaterally to us. And I think that it has to be deliberate because they have to understand this. Even the FATF now has a commission where they are investigating the unintended consequences of the application of their own rules and standards. And that unintended consequence is de-risking. They've recognized this and they're trying to address it. The EU doesn't.
Well, thank you for that and providing some insight on kind of the practical implications of this. That's very helpful. So climate change, I think we all have an idea in our mind of how that impacts the Caribbean. Climate, of course, is a key global focus. Climate disclosure is a key SEC focus. Can you share your thoughts on how climate change may burden some countries and what can be done about it?
Well, let me start with what can be done about it. In the first place, as I mentioned, we need to transition to net zero by 2050. What does that mean? We need to make sure that we're removing as much carbon from the atmosphere as we're adding. We need to limit the increase in global temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius. And so that means we need to really push a renewable energy focus. And what are the effects? Well, today I'm living that effect. Right now, we are being affected in Barbados and more so in Trinidad, where I am from, which is south of where I am now, by a storm. And this is a very unusual storm. First of all, it's very early in the hurricane season that only just begun. It is the first storm that I am aware of in my lifetime that is so far south. It even was as far south as Guyana. And it's going to cut straight through Trinidad, straight through northern Venezuela, onto Aruba and Curacao, countries and islands that almost never see tropical storms and hurricanes. And that just goes to show just how unexpected, unanticipated, unpredictable, and severely damaging climate change can be, because the countries that are used to hurricanes are prepared for it. These countries in the south are not. We're not used to this. Trinidad does not get hit by hurricanes, not in my lifetime. And guess what? Today and tomorrow they're going to be hit by a tropical storm that hasn't been named yet. If it's named, it's going to be called Bonnie. But Trinidad is not prepared. And so it costs us lives. Literally, people die every year. It costs us livelihoods. Literally, people lose their jobs. People lose their homes. I remember this friend of mine in the Bahamas in 2019 when Hurricane Dorian hit. A tree fell on top both her cars, and her 2 cars were totaled instantly. And the amount of people who the same thing happened to, they all then put in orders for cars and then had to wait for months because there isn't enough supply. These are the ways in which we don't even begin to understand. The fact that I have to walk through seaweed, a pile of seaweed this high. When I was learning to surf last year, I've given up because you can't surf in seaweed. The fact that you have to literally walk through a pile of seaweed this high. Can you imagine as a tourist, if you've paid money to go on holiday and this is what you see on the seashore, you probably never come back. You probably leave early. So it's having untold effects on us in this region.
So, it's interesting. You mentioned some of the impact and the economic impact from the hurricanes. As you know, interest rate hikes, supply chain issues, high food, energy prices, they're currently impacting the U.S. also. But, can you give a little bit more insight on how some of these additional factors impact smaller economies who are dealing with these same global challenges that we are here in the U.S.?
Yes, of course, we are consumers massive consumers of imports. 80 to 90% of what we consume is imported. So whereas in your country, for example, domestic producers are passing the inflation costs on, that this is first of all, last year, the inflation you felt in America was demand driven. Now it's largely supply driven, and hiking interest rates helps to reduce consumption and aggregate demand and helps to dampen inflation. But because 80 to 90% of what we consume is imported, if we raise interest rates, it doesn't affect any of that. It really just makes the cost of living higher for us because it increased the cost of borrowing. So our central banks, we have 2 central banks in the region that have started hiking interest rates, and that's Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. But the rest of us, we haven't. And the reason for that is because it will make no difference except to further increase the cost of living. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that we're suffering the same effects of the inflation, except that we don't have the policy tools to address it, because we have no choice but to import the food, import the fuel, and import the medicine at whatever cost we can get it at. And what that means is that the average person now has to choose very carefully what they buy, how much electricity they use, how much they drive their cars. And that has, in addition to the pandemic, has caused more people to fall into poverty. And we've had a massive increase in poverty during this pandemic, in some countries to levels that we have not seen since the 1970s. So it's really one crisis after another that we're coping, and I shouldn't say coping, that we're really struggling with in this region. And then the EU adding its nonsense on top of all of that really is so unfair.
So, in talking about these issues, economists generally see issues and these types of challenges from a lot of different perspectives. Dare I ask, is there actually a bright side to higher inflation and higher food and energy costs? Like, what could that be if that was the case?
So I would highlight two things that I see as potential bright sides. In the first place, high fuel prices, I think, will cause a lot of people to think more carefully about the types of cars they drive, how much they drive, and what arrangements they make to get to and from work and school and so on. And companies as well, in terms of how they demand whether their employees come in or can work from home. So hopefully this will cause a bit of a rethink. I, for example, drive an electric vehicle. I have no idea what the price of gasoline is, and I tell everybody this so that maybe when they have a choice to make, they will also choose to buy an electric vehicle that, by the way, on my network that I charge on, it's 100% solar energy. Yep, my car is 100% solar charged. So that's one thing that I think will be hopefully a positive outcome out of all of this. The second thing is, in the Caribbean, we have what's called the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM. And CARICOM for years, for decades, has languished, I think, in terms of what it really achieved. And I see that lately we have our next heads of government meeting on the 4th of July. Every year, the 4th of July, CARICOM meets. So it's a special day for us as well. And I see more CARICOM heads of state and CARICOM as an institution driving greater cooperation regionally from a food and fuel security perspective. Guyana being sort of the real champion of this. I'm not sure if you know, but Guyana is the fastest growing economy in the world and the world's newest oil producer, which maybe is not a good thing to talk about now, but it can certainly help our region from avoiding or mitigating the uncertainty and the price problems as it relates to energy security. So I think these are two possible positive outcomes that we might be able to look forward to.
Your perspectives have really been enlightening. So thank you so much for sharing those. That is the end of the questions that I had as part of the fireside chat. I don't know if Christy or Candace, if you have access to any questions that might have come through the chat box.
Sure thing. I'm taking a tally right now.
I'm sorry if you're not able to hear me well, but there was a question of, are you seeing signs from Caribbean nations that they're investing in renewable energy?
Yes, I did hear the question, and absolutely, there are positive signs across the region. I think that Aruba and Barbados so far are the leaders in this regard. In Barbados, we had passed legislation years ago that allows people to generate their own solar power on their roofs and feed it back into the grid so that you get a bill that nets off your contribution versus your usage. Which is quite an important reform to the way that the grid operates. And like I said, we do promote electric vehicles. We have an electric fleet of buses here in Barbados. Bermuda has also started using electric buses. And I think it's important to distinguish between electric vehicles that are charged with fossil fuels versus solar. That grid that charges electric vehicles here in Barbados is 100% solar. So it means no fossil fuels goes into fueling these vehicles, including the buses. And we're also seeing governments reducing taxes, import duties, for example, on electric vehicles and also on solar and other renewable energy installations. In the British Virgin Islands and in Curacao, I've seen pretty robust wind turbines and that type of renewable energy. So I think that it's certainly a phenomenon that is catching on across the region. I don't think it's happening fast enough. In some countries, it's happening pretty fast here in Barbados, but in some countries, I think it could move a little bit faster. But hopefully this crisis and where oil prices are now is going to send a clear message that we need to move more quickly.
Hi, I have a question. But you mentioned 3 points, economic points, and on 2 of them, the economic warfare and the climate crisis, I'm curious whether you see any correlation between those 2 points and the increasing involvement of China in the Caribbean, and whether that involvement is a wise decision. Do you think Caribbean states are basically exchanging former colonial powers to future colonial power? And just want to get a sense of how you see the China involvement with the Caribbean states from an economic perspective.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. And lots of people look at Chinese investment and interest into this region as neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism. I guess you could take that perspective, but the thing is, it's not imposed. I mean, the countries that are doing business and inviting foreign direct investment and bilateral relationships with China are doing so on their own free will, and it's invited, and it's presumably in full recognition and acknowledgement of the risks and the benefits, one would hope. I think there have been mistakes made. I see, for example, in my country, my finance minister proudly announced in his budget speech or something after a speech after his budget speech last year that we don't need to borrow from the IMF because we get money from the Chinese at 5% or whatever the rate was, and they don't ask as many questions. So in other words, there's clearly an incentive to go with China as opposed to a development bank, for example, because the procurement standards are lower. And so it means that, some of these political leaders, I would say, get a chance to do things by bending the rules and maybe cutting corners versus if they had to borrow this money from a development bank and adhere to the strict procurement standards that goes with that. So I do think that some mistakes have been made. I will say, however, that there are 2 things that drive growth in this region: investment and exports. And because we struggle so much with dealing with the climate crisis and dealing with all of the other things that cost money every year, pandemic is another example, there isn't a lot of money left in the state's coffers for investment. And the private sector has to pay very high interest rates to borrow for investment. So we are a region that relies very heavily on inward investment, foreign direct investment. And the Chinese have been very willing to lend for that purpose, whereas other bilateral lenders or other bilateral partners, I should say, maybe have not been as willing and as generous as the Chinese. So it's really hard for a prime minister or minister of finance, for example, to say, I really need to upgrade my airport. I don't have the money to do it. The Chinese are willing to finance it for me, whereas other countries that I've reached out to for assistance are not willing. What do I do? So it's, there are choices that they have to make. Sometimes the choice is rational and it makes sense. And sometimes I think maybe there's a little too much gray and it's not black and white. I'm not particularly worried about it from a domination type perspective. The Chinese they have a Belt and Road Initiative that many countries across the developing world have been signatories to, including Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados, for example, Suriname, I think. And they're not trying to hide what their agenda is. Their agenda is plain for everybody to see. And it's a question of, do you want to be part of this or do you not? And so the freedom and the choice rests with the political leaders we elect, and let's hope they make the right choice. If they're not, well, then you need to agitate for change.
I have one additional question. In our individual lives, what do you think that we can do? What are some suggested steps or actions that we can take to start incrementally, at least, making advances and improvements in the three big issues that you described to us today?
That's a good question. With respect to gender equality, I mean, look at your policy framework and see how best you can support not just women, but families and those who are caregivers for children, as well as the elderly. I think that's probably the most fundamental and important thing, because women are shouldering, and especially during the pandemic, as you would have seen on one of my slides, a disproportionate burden of the childcare and elderly care responsibilities. And we need to find a way to support caregivers. And so there's lots of policies that you can implement that do just that. With respect to blacklisting and unfair treatment of small post-colonial states, I would say reach out to your legislators and reach out to those who are responsible for foreign policy and make sure that they're aware. Because a lot of people, I was just in Ireland last week and had talked about this, and the shock and horror on the faces of European people is never lost on me, because they have no idea that their own countries, their own member states, their own governments are doing this to small countries, and they don't understand why. So wherever you can amplify your voice to be heard on this issue, please do so. And on the issue of the climate crisis, I don't call it climate change anymore, because it's not change. When I have a storm that's hitting me that's way further south than any other storm ever has been, especially in this time of year, it's a crisis. It's not change. I think that it's very important to be extremely mindful of the way that we live and our lifestyles. And a simple thing like, which car do you drive? What fuel does it use? How far do you drive? Do you need to fly as much as you do? Do you need to drive as much as you do? Do you need to consume the way that we do? And it's not easy to make these changes, but even companies that have labeled their products as greener or renewable or environmentally sensitive have been shown to perform better in terms of their bottom line and in terms of their share price, simply because the market is shifting in terms of the way that it wants to consume more consciously, especially millennials. So these are the things we need to think about in changing the way that we behave and the way that we conduct our operations and our everyday lives.
Awesome. That's been very, very informative. I'm seeing no additional questions in the chat. I'll take a look at my email just to make sure that nothing else has come through. I think that's it. Wonderful.
Thank you, Christy.
Well, thank you. I'm going to do go ahead. You have another question?
I'm sorry, and please forgive my 6-year-old who's in the background. She's in her parrot phase. But there are actually a few more questions that Harvey was just able to send to me if we're able to take a little bit more time to ask maybe 2 more questions.
2 more questions?
I think we have time if Marla's willing.
I am.
Okay. Wonderful. And this just goes to the gender issue that you were discussing as caretaker, working from home with my 6-year-old at home. So the first question is, the countries that contribute to climate damage in the Caribbean also send millions of tourists to the Caribbean. Do you think a climate tax could educate those tourists about the consequences of their carbon emissions?
Absolutely. I love that idea. And you're right. I think that there are some governments that are starting to think along these lines. I mean, I've tried to talk to, for example, people in the Cayman Islands about this. I don't know if you're aware, but the highest point in the Cayman Islands is actually their waste dump. Simply because there's so much of it because of the volume of tourists. And it really is a challenge. Tourism does put a strain on the environments locally in terms of handling the waste, but also in terms of carbon emissions. And that's a brilliant idea. I think that more governments in this region need to think along those lines. The problem is we're so competitive. And if Barbados, for example, imposes a tax on tourists that is an environmental tax that will go towards mitigating the climate crisis, then our neighboring competitors like St. Lucia and Anguilla, who are not taxing their tourists, will likely see tourists shift to that destination. So it's something that as a region we have to tackle. But even that tax alone is not going to be enough. As I mentioned, we need $2.5 to $4 trillion a year to mitigate the climate crisis that we have now by financing that green energy transition. That's what we really, really need. And unfortunately, it's the world's biggest polluters that are the ones. We're busy changing and converting to renewable energy here in the Caribbean, but already we account for only less than 1% of global carbon emissions. It's the largest polluters that need to make that transition more importantly than we do.
Thank you. And finally, with so many people leaving the Caribbean, are there any stats on people from the G7 countries buying and residing in the Caribbean? And are there any implications of this?
We do have, that's a net outward migration number that I think it was 7 million that I had highlighted earlier. So that's outward minus inward. And we do have, especially during the pandemic and with the digital nomad programs that we've had in the region, we do have lots of foreigners coming to our shores to wait out the pandemic or to enjoy the environment instead of being locked down. Well, no more lockdowns now, but when there were lockdowns. And yes, we do see some countries like the Cayman Islands, like Bermuda, Barbados to a lesser extent, having a challenge where you have wealthy foreigners buying up property as an investment and as a vacation home. And then it means that we have property price inflation that then prices the local people out of the property market. And so you have, I mean, again, coming from Ireland, where I was just last week, and you hear that a lot of people in their 30s are living with their parents because they can't afford to buy a home. And so by no means is this isolated to the Caribbean, but yes, it is a challenge, and it is something that I think fiscal policy and tax policy needs to address, but we haven't really done that yet.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Marla. What an incredible, thought-provoking, and informative discussion. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I just found it absolutely enlightening. On behalf of the SEC and the Caribbean American Heritage Committee, we want to thank you once again for making the time to speak with us and tell us about your impactful work research. It was a great honor and pleasure to hear your story, and we wish you continued progress and success with all of your very commendable efforts. We also want to thank all of the individuals and groups who are instrumental in helping us put on today's program. Chair Gensler, particularly thank you very much for the opening remarks. Cicely, thank you for serving as moderator and my esteemed co-sponsor on the committee. And finally, special thanks also to the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, the Office of Public Affairs Internal Communications and Design teams, and the audiovisual team, and all who had a hand in executing today's program. The Caribbean American Heritage Committee is open to all SEC employees and contractors, and we invite you to attend any of our future meetings and events, which will be published on SEC Today. If you have any questions, please send an email to cahc@sec.gov. I also want to bring everyone's attention to the Caribbean American Heritage Committee's virtual book club discussion of the book Island Queen by Vanessa Riley this Thursday at noon. Island Queen is a historical novel based on the true life story of Dorothy Kerwin Thomas, a free Black woman who rose from slavery to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful landowners in the colonial West Indies. This book is available at many public libraries, and it's the committee's first book club meeting, and everyone is encouraged to attend and participate in an engaging discussion. Once again, thank you, Marla, and we hope you all had a fantastic celebration today of Caribbean Heritage Month, and as always, take care and be safe.
Thank you.